Good morning, this is Ron, and welcome to Story Time. And good morning, this is Sunday, and let's see. I always forget the date. I'm thinking that this is going to be the 15th, July 15th. So anyways, we're doing the 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, and we're on Law 18. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. The world is dangerous and enemies are everywhere. Everyone has to protect themselves. A fortress seems the safest, but isolation exposes you to more dangers than it protects you from. It cuts you off from valuable information, it makes you conspicuous and an easy target. Better to circulate among people, find allies, mingle. You are shielded from your enemies by the crowd. Machiavelli makes the argument that, in a strictly military sense, a fortress is invariably a mistake. It becomes a symbol of power's isolation and is an easy target for its builder's enemies. Designed to defend you, fortresses actually cut you off from help and cut into your flexibility. They may appear impregnable, but once you retire to one, everyone knows where you are, and a siege does not have to succeed to turn your fortress into a prison. With their small and confined spaces, fortresses are also extremely vulnerable to the plague and contagious diseases. In a strategic sense, the isolation of a fortress provides no protection and actually creates more problems than it solves. Because humans are social creatures by nature, power depends on social interaction and circulation. To make yourself powerful, you must place yourself at the center of things, as Louis XIV did at Versailles. All activity should revolve around you, and you should be aware of everything happening on the street and of anyone who might be hatching plots against you. The danger for most people comes when they feel threatened. In such times, they tend to retreat and close ranks, to find security in a kind of fortress. In doing so, however, they come to rely for information on a smaller and smaller circle and lose perspective on events around them. They lose maneuverability and become easy targets, and their isolation makes them paranoid. As in warfare and most games of strategy, isolation often precedes defeat and death. In moments of uncertainty and danger, you need to fight this desire to turn inward. Instead, make yourself more accessible. Seek out old allies and make new ones. Force yourself into more and more different circles. This has been the trick of powerful people for centuries. The Roman statesman Cicero was born into the lower nobility and had little chance of power unless he managed to make a place for himself among the aristocrats who controlled the city. He succeeded brilliantly, identifying everyone with influence and figuring out how they were connected to one another. He mingled everywhere, knew everyone, and had such a vast network of connections that an enemy here could easily be counterbalanced by an ally there. The French statesman Talleyrand played the game the same way. Although he came from one of the oldest aristocratic families in France, he made a point of always staying in touch with what was happening in the streets of Paris, allowing him to foresee trends and troubles. He even got a certain pleasure out of mingling with shady criminal types, who supplied him with valuable information. Every time there's a crisis, a transition of power, the end of the Directory, the fall of Napoleon, the abdication of Louis XVIII, he was able to survive and even thrive because he never closed himself up in a small circle, but always forged connections with the new order. This law pertains to kings and queens and to those of the highest power. The moment you lose contact with your people, seeking security in isolation, rebellion is brewing. Never imagine yourself so elevated that you can afford to cut yourself off from even the lowest echelons. By retreating to a fortress, you can make yourself an easy target for your plotting subjects, who view your isolation as an insult and a reason for rebellion. Since humans are such social creatures, it follows that the social arts that make us pleasant to be around can be practiced only by constant exposure and circulation. The more you are in contact with others, the more graceful and at ease you become. Isolation, on the other hand, engenders an awkwardness in your gestures and leads to further isolation as people start avoiding you. In 1545, Duke Cosimo de' Medici decided that to ensure immortality of his name, he would commission frescoes for the main chapel of the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. He had a great many painters to choose from, and in the end he picked Jacopo di Pontormo. Getting on in years, Pontormo wanted to make the frescoes his legacy. His first decision was to close the chapel off with walls, partitions, and blinds. He wanted no one to witness the creation of his masterpiece or to steal his ideas. He would outdo Michelangelo himself. When some young men broke into the chapel out of curiosity, Jacopo sealed it off even further. Pontormo filled the chapel ceiling with biblical scenes, the creation, Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, on and on. At the top of the middle wall, he painted Christ in his majesty, raising the dead on Judgment Day. The artist worked on the chapel for 11 years, rarely leaving it, since he had developed a phobia for human contact and was afraid his ideas would be stolen. Pontormo died before completing the frescoes, and none of them has survived. But the great Renaissance writer Vasari, a friend of Pontormo's who saw the frescoes shortly after the artist's death, left a description of what they looked like. There was a total lack of proportion. Scenes bumped against scenes, figures in one story being juxtaposed with those in another in maddening numbers. Pontormo had become obsessed with detail, but had lost any sense of the overall composition. Vasari left off his description of the frescoes by writing that if he continued, I think I would go mad and become entangled in this painting, just as I believe that anyone in the 11 years of time Jacopo spent on it, he entangled himself and anyone else who saw it. Instead of crowning Pontormo's career, the work became his undoing. These frescoes were visual equivalents of the effects of isolation on the human mind, a loss of proportion, an obsession with detail combined with an inability to see the larger picture, a kind of extravagant ugliness that no longer communicates. Clearly, isolation is as deadly for the creative arts as for the social arts. Shakespeare is the most famous writer in history because, as a dramatist for the popular stage, he opened himself up to the masses, making his work accessible to people no matter what their education and taste. Artists who hold themselves up in their fortress lose a sense of proportion, their work communicating only to their small circle. Such art remains cornered and powerless. Finally, since power is a human creation, it is inevitably increased by contact with other people. Instead of falling into the fortress mentality, view the world in the following manner. It is like a vast Versailles, with every room communicating with another. You need to be permeable, able to float in and out of different circles and mix with different types. That kind of mobility and social contact will protect you from plotters who will be unable to keep secrets from you and from your enemies, who will be able to isolate you from your allies. Always on the move, you mix and mingle in the rooms of the palace, never sitting or settling in one place. No hunter can fix his aim on such a swift-moving creature. It is hardly ever right and propitious to choose isolation. Without keeping an ear on what is happening in the streets, you'll be unable to protect yourself. About the only thing that constant human contact cannot facilitate is thought. The weight of society's pressure to conform and the lack of distance from other people can make it impossible to think clearly about what is going on around you. As a temporary recourse, then, isolation can help you to gain perspective. Many a serious thinker has produced in prisons. Many a serious thinker has been produced in prisons where we have nothing to do but think. Machiavelli could write The Prince only once he found himself in exile and isolated on a farm far from the political intrigues of Florence. The danger is, however, that this kind of isolation will sire all kinds of strange and perverted ideas. You may gain perspective on the larger picture, but you lose a sense of your own smallness and limitations. Also, the more isolated you are, the harder it is to break out of your isolation when you choose to. It sinks you deep into its quicksand without your noticing. If you need time to think then, choose isolation only as a last resort and only in small doses. Be careful to keep your way back into society open. And that was Law 19. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. And again, this is one of the laws that reminds me of President Donald J. Trump, who, despite the fact that he is, I would think a lot of people in his position that is getting as much heat, as much criticism, ridicule, and worse, threats and whatnot, might have a natural tendency or inclination to hold themselves up in a fortress, in this particular case, the White House, and that they would be rather uncommunicative and, again, become isolated, and all of the problems of isolation then would visit them. But with Donald Trump, he doesn't allow that to happen. He goes out and does what he needs to do. He goes out, for instance, he was in France the other day for Bastille Day, and he went to the G20 meeting, and he also keeps in touch with the regular common people, the people that voted for him, by holding rallies, continue to hold rallies on a regular basis, even though he's already been elected. I don't know of any other president that would do such a thing. Usually they would, if they're going to have some kind of a meeting with the rank and file supporters, it would be to give a speech to advance a particular piece of legislation, usually. So, but with Donald Trump, he's not afraid to go out and mingle, despite the fact that he's been subjected to a lot of ridicule, etc. Anyways, that was Law 18. Tomorrow, on Sunday, is, of course, Law 19. Know who you're dealing with. Do not offend the wrong person. There are many different kinds of people in the world, and you could never assume that everyone will react to your strategies in the same way. Deceive or outmaneuver some people, and they will spend the rest of their lives seeking revenge. They are wolves in lamb's clothing. Choose your victims and opponents carefully, then never offend or deceive the wrong person. And that will be tomorrow, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.
Mm-hmm.